Okay, here we go. Friday was great. The video's not great, but in person, everybody who came to the class, I really enjoyed that more than I expected. So definitely Fridays are going to be in-person lectures from now on. It's tough to speak to a camera. It's just harder for me to do a good job of teaching. There's midterms going on right now, so I did that, live recording as a favor to all of you who said, "Oh, I'd rather not come to class. I'd rather you continue online." So if you missed the class on Friday, I'm actually uploading the file right now so you can see, but the angle isn't very good because I was missing some equipment. I'm gonna do it one more time this Friday. So that'll be week 9. This Friday, the second lecture of week 9. I'll record it live again and I'll see if I can do a better job, because who knows what's gonna happen. Nobody knows really if Corona's gonna go away or it's gonna come back and get worse. I have a feeling that we will have to be flexible. So I don't mind doing it again, but after next week, I'm probably not going to turn the camera on and you need to come to class. So this is the deal. This coming Friday, same as this Friday, it's optional if you attend, but I mean, it's not optional if you attend, except there's some excuses, okay? If you live in a town, if you live outside of Daejeon, if you live in Gyeongju even, or you live in Sejong and it takes you a long time and you're coming for one class, I'll let you watch the video. But I don't want an empty classroom. I want everybody who's in the dormitory, in Gungdong, somewhere in Daejeon, you come to class, okay? Unless you have a midterm that day, if you're exhausted from studying, or if you have a midterm, I will let you skip the class next Friday and watch the video. Or if you're outside, or if you got coronavirus or you're exposed to coronavirus, okay? Those are the 3 reasons. You live in another city, you're exhausted from midterms or you have more midterms to go and you feel like you need that time, or you're sick from coronavirus, or you're possibly infected, okay? Otherwise, it was good to see you in the class, so I expect you to be there. I will take attendance next Friday. I didn't this week, but next week I'm going to. There's a little application on your phone. It's pretty easy. Just press the button, and if you're there, it just pops up on my attendance taking app. I hope to make this lecture a little bit shorter than the ones I've done recently. What I said is I'm going to try and balance the Friday and the Wednesday one. So the Wednesday one that I record is probably going to be around an hour each time, and the Friday lecture an hour as well. So rather than having like a 30-minute one and then a long one on Friday, because on Friday it's nice to stop the class around lunchtime, rather than taking a break. Probably just do lecture for like whatever it takes to get the material done, 70 minutes or 75 minutes, and by 12:15 we'll be done, and we'll just do it like that. Then all of us can have lunch. I actually have a class at 1 o'clock anyway, so if we just go from 11 o'clock until 12 something, then I can actually eat, and I don't feel exhausted and sick by the time 6 o'clock rolls around and it's dinner time. So this is what I want to talk about first. We did talk about America, but I did neglect talking about Scotland the entire course. And this is a British culture course, and although Scotland is not as important as England, it's very important. There wouldn't be a British culture, there wouldn't be a Great Britain without Scotland. One of the students said the other day, it may have been on Friday, what is the United Kingdom of Great Britain? Is Ireland part of it? No, it's not. It was always the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, okay? Now the United Kingdom has 6 counties of Ireland, Northern Ireland, is part of the United Kingdom now. That's because when Ireland became independent, quite frankly, the British government was deceptive about granting the independence, and they allowed the northern part, which does have a Protestant, British oriented population, to remain. That's not what the Irish expected, and there has been, I mean, the Irish problems have mostly been caused by the British government and by the English government. I'm not blaming them for everything, but we talked about Cromwell killing as many Irish Catholics as he could. It's been a religious, cultural, national issue, which has only recently stopped to being violent. And there, you have to understand, it's sort of like the way Koreans feel about Japan occupying, invading, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Lee Sun-shin being a hero, and Chosun remaining free of Japanese influence, and then the Japanese coming back, in the 20th century and occupying, annexing Chosun and turning it into a colony, and then them being expelled, in 1945 by the American invasion of the Japanese home islands. Imagine there was sort of no break between 1592, which is close to the time. It's a little bit early, but that Henry VIII and his ancestors, and Queen Elizabeth, and King Charles and Cromwell, the whole 15th, 16th, 17th century, there was something called the Irish problem, and many of those problems were just caused by the English crown claiming that Ireland was a kingdom that was under their control, but they're not the King of Ireland. They never were. Okay, so the United Kingdom is separate. Ireland was never part of it. It was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Even the British admitted that. Okay, Northern Ireland has now been incorporated into the British, this is 100 years ago. But before that, Ireland was a complete island nation, which was ruled by the British Parliament without any representation. But Northern Ireland is a Protestant Irish enclave, you might say. And I have a lot of Irish friends, I have a lot of British friends. It's a very difficult issue. Basically, I don't have a good solution for that. I'm just telling you the history is very complex, and there's a lot of frustration and bad blood about that. And if you're Korean and you grew up learning about the history and the tension between Japan and Korea, you can probably understand that. Scotland is a different story. Scotland also has its people that would rather remain independent. Unlike Ireland, it did fight successfully for its independence, which is a remarkable thing. But around the time of Queen Elizabeth, of course, King James became the king of both. Like, he was Scottish, not English, really. He was more Scottish than English, and he became the king of England. So there became more and more connections between Scotland and England. But there always was. The Vikings took over all of Scotland and Northern England. Northern England is affected by Scottish culture, and Southern Scotland is affected by Northern English culture. The closer you get to the Scottish border, the more the cultures blend. Up in the Highlands and the mountains in the northern part of Scotland, you get a little bit, unique Scottish culture, and you go farther, even to the islands in the north, the Shetlands and the Orkney, which I mentioned, I think, maybe a month ago in a lecture. You get almost like a Scottish Viking culture when you get up there, which is fascinating, I think. So the Scottish really managed to keep their culture intact and absorb some of the Englishness, obviously the language, but they have their own pronunciation, and they still do speak Gaelic, as do the Irish. They've held on to their language, but they all speak English, fluently. But there's Scottish dialect, which is often depending on where they live, the version of their dialect or accent can be very, very thick and almost incomprehensible, you might say. They're usually pretty cool about it, especially if they're celebrities. But you know, the Scottish are a very small group of people, population-wise, and their land is not an attractive place to live. It's kind of like living in North Korea, right? You know, there's mountain. It's not easy to grow rice. It's not an ideal place. You know, Vietnam has a huge population because they can harvest rice 3 times a year. Growing rice in North Korea is a struggle, right? It's a harsh climate. It's cold and it's rocky. There's not a lot of soil or water, and to be a farmer there is tough. And the Scottish, most of their wealth came from, you know, sheep, from their herds. A lot of herdsmen, grazing was a much more effective way to grow, to be successful as a farmer, to be a shepherd of some sort, to have goats and sheep and some sort of livestock would have been a much better option than trying to, like, you know, grow wheat in large quantity. As you get to England and you go farther south, it's more like rolling hills and rocky territory. In Wales, it's very mountainous and rocky, beautiful, but not ideal for. It's more forest and rock and mountains and these beautiful scenes, but not really conducive to agriculture. You get down to the southeast of England, the part that's heavily populated and closest to France. That's the place where you can grow a lot of food, and so that's where all the wealth. Like, I mean, having a food surplus or a stable food source is obviously a very important factor in how wealthy you are. So we got Scotland here. There's only 2 pages. There's a picture of a guy. Of course, he's playing the bagpipes. I did mention that the Scottish fought 2 wars successfully to defend themselves way back, you know, in the Black Death, you know, period at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century, and they won. Eventually, they won, and they remained independent until 1707, when they became part of the Union. They had their own religion. They decided to create the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, which is Presbyterian. Now there's Presbyterian churches in England and Ireland and Canada. My father is a Presbyterian minister. He's not Scottish, he's Canadian. Presbyterian Church of Canada. There's the American Presbyterian Church, which is the largest. They were very influential and they sent missionaries to Korea. There's the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in the United States as well. There's a Presbyterian Church in Korea. When you go back to Canada, there's Korean Presbyterian churches in Canada now. And there are Koreans who go to church at Chanlo Gyohe, but some of them go to join Canadian Presbyterian churches. Some of them have made their own Korean Chanlo Gyohe in Canada and America too. But that's just where they came from. That's just where they originally came from. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland has no power over any of the other branches. It's not like the Catholic Church. There's no Pope, as we said. That's one of the reasons they created the Presbyterian Church, was so that there wouldn't be one leader. Their country's very rugged, as I just said. It's very mountainous and rocky. They're isolated. They're not an island, but they're, you know, sticking up in towards the Arctic and the North Sea. And England blocks them from access to Europe. Really, if you're in Scotland, you got to go over to Norway. And if you want to get down to Europe, you got to go past England. So to a certain extent, when Scotland and England were fighting each other, and the English always had a bigger navy, always have, probably always will, more military strength, the Scotland really had to make friends with. They were friends with the French, because if the French didn't keep the English busy and the Scottish and the English fought, they were outnumbered and outgunned. So that's the old alliance we talked about. But that old alliance kind of collapsed in the 17th century. And that left, when that collapsed, when William and Queen Anne defeated Louis XIV eventually in the wars that they fought. Queen Anne's War, we call it, some of us. The 7 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Austrian Succession. There's a whole bunch of wars between England and France, and France loses most of them. Louis XIV takes over half of Europe, but when he dies, the territory is shrinking again. So the main problem is financial problems. England has financial problems too, but compared to France, they're minor. The French crown is wealthy under Louis XIV, but after he dies, there's going to be a series of not very great French kings, Louis XV and Louis XVI. Louis XIV lives so long that he lives longer than his son, right? Just like Edward III lived longer than the Black Prince. So you end up with a young king who's his grandson. His grandson ends up taking over, but Louis is king of France for like 71 years, something ridiculous. So everybody gets used to this powerful, rich king, but when he dies, the next king, the kings that follow him are much weaker, and they can't control France the same way as grandfather and great-grandfather did. So you end up with the French Revolution eventually because of many factors, social factors, cultural factors, but as I said to you many times, death and taxes. The government of France runs out of money. They're taxing the French people too much, and then there's a problem with bread. There's bad harvests. They have some bad weather and bad harvests, and people start dying. It's death and taxes again. So this is in the future. This is still almost 100 years ahead of time. So, I'm not doing the history like year by year thing anymore. We're gonna jump back and forth depending on what we're talking about. Right now we're talking about Scotland. Scotland is allied with France. France is losing the wars and becoming less influential. They get rid of their Catholic King James II, and Charles II also was kind of friendly to the French and secretly getting money. They get William to be the king. He's Protestant and wants nothing. He wants to defeat France, right? And Scotland has to take sides. They have to decide, are they going to keep fighting? But Scotland's actually not Catholic anymore, as you can see. So they don't really, it's an unnatural thing. Mary, Queen of Scots, is Catholic. She dies. Elizabeth has her killed. Her son, King James, is not Catholic. Basically, by the time we get to 1707, there's not very many Catholics in Scotland anymore, only, in the countryside or in the mountains where the Highlanders live. And some of them are still Catholic, but most Scottish people who live in cities and have power are Presbyterian. So this is much more compatible with the Anglican Church, as long as they don't insist, as long as the English don't say, you have to be Anglican. Being Protestant is enough. You can be Presbyterian. England's going to be English. We're both Protestant. We're on the same side. Scotland runs out of money. They try to have their own colony. Actually, it's a crazy endeavor down in Panama, close to South America. They make a go of it, and they send thousands of settlers there. But basically, they don't have the money to support it. So the whole effort goes bankrupt, and the English they're involved in that. They don't help. In fact, they actively prevent the Scottish from trading through England and maintaining their economic connections with the continent. So Scotland's going broke. They're running out of money. Their colonies have failed. France, their ally, is being defeated. They vote, and one of the things is the English say, we'll pay for your debt. We'll pay the money that your government owes. We'll save your economy, and we'll join the country together, and you can have your representatives in Parliament, and you can vote, and you can send your representatives to Parliament to represent Scotland, and we'll form a country together, and together we'll be stronger, and economically you'll be stabilized. It was too much for most of those leaders of Scotland who were economically damaged. They're the wealthy people, right? It was too enticing. It was a very close vote, but they knew that to prosper, they needed this union. So they kind of blackmailed, the English kind of blackmailed the Scottish, right? The majority of Scottish people probably wanted to be independent at the time, but the people who were ruling the countries, even though they're elected, they're still the upper class. The upper class Scottish decided that this was what they wanted to do. And of course, both sides benefited from it, but the Scottish had to make some sacrifices because they lost their independence. Now in the United Kingdom, Scotland has their own parliament, and they basically they have their own pound. There's a Scottish pound, and there's a British pound, so they have their own money, and they're linked, to England. The government is the Prime Minister of England, of the United Kingdom, is the Prime Minister of Scotland and England, but they have their own parliamentary system. So does Wales and Northern Ireland too. So it's different now. But then they combined it and they had one parliament, and the imperial bureaucracy was this is when the British Empire really starts to take form, and we can say this sparsely populated, poor, isolated, rugged, Presbyterian nation, country, kingdom is an important part of it. And we have to add, their society is something unique about the Scottish is because they had this Presbyterian emphasis on the Bible, a lot of them could read. And this is 300 years ago. The literacy rate in Korea is tiny, right? The people are still using Hanja and refusing to use Hangul, just so that Korean people can't read, right? If you read any writing from a Korean scholar from 1700, it's all written in Hanja still, because the Yangban still wanted to use Hanja, and Hangul really wasn't used. The first female Korean writers, the first Korean female poets, they wrote in Hangul. Why? Because they didn't get the formal education that they needed, and Hangul was easy enough for them. So some of the first Korean poetry in Hangul is done by Korean women. Anyway, what happens here in Scotland is that the emphasis on the Bible and knowing the Bible and reading the Bible in English transforms them into a literate society. One of the first literate societies in the world. We're talking 60-70% of Scottish people in the 18th century are able to read, right? So they have only a few million people, but most of them can read. But they have way more literate people than countries much bigger than them. So you end up with this group of people that are philosophers, historians, David Hume, Adam Smith. Off the top of my head, I can't think of some of the other. Adam Smith is a famous economist. David Hume is a famous historian. But there's 20, 30 of these guys. Unfortunately, I don't know of any women that are in that group. There's still discrimination about women participating in intellectual circles. But there's a whole group of Scottish people that very influential Enlightenment thinkers. They're humanists. They're thinking about, they're Christian humanists. So they're thinking about human nature and human ideas. And we talked about John Locke and Isaac Newton, right? These guys, they revolutionized the way that we think about the world. They helped develop the modern world. The invisible hand of the market, the capitalism, the idea of a free market economy. That's Adam Smith. The belief that the capitalism is the most profitable way to develop an economy. That's Adam Smith. He's Scottish. It's remarkable. It's remarkable considering how small the country is, how poor it was, and how isolated it was. That these had a huge, enormous effect on the world, on the development of the modern world. There's some really good books that I've read about how important Scotland is. So the reason that Scotland has so many smart people is because they can read. And the reason they can read is because they studied the Bible first. That sounds like a quiz question to me. Okay, Chapter 4, which I call the hard fork. The hard fork is actually going to be next lecture. I'm going to talk about that on Friday. But today we're going to talk about the colonies because we need a little bit of background. So it's 1707 over here and it's 1720s down there. But we're going to rewind for a second right back to, Columbus, okay? But I'm going to skip talking about Columbus, even though it's the next part of the book. I don't want to talk about Columbus now because I'm going to talk about native people as one topic, and I'm going to talk about slavery as another topic, and I'm going to talk about the development of the colonies now, okay? So like I said, rather than talking about things in order of time like we did in the British culture section, we're going to rewind and talk about one thing and then rewind and then talk about another thing. So the 13 colonies, by the time of the eve of the revolution in 1776, there are 13 colonies. That's why it's the unlucky number 13 comes up all the time, because that's the number in 1776. But really the original colonies, we can say from 1620 is when King James, remember, let's rewind, he's alive again. I'm going to bring him back from the dead with his big head and his oversized tongue and his skinny legs. King James, he's in England. He's a Scottish king of England. Queen Elizabeth is dead. Queen Elizabeth tried a little experiment trying to make a colony. Virginia is called Virginia because it's Virgin Queen. It's named after Queen Elizabeth. Nice little tip of the hat to her. They tried to make a colony down there. Sir Walter Raleigh is one of the explorers, adventurers, and wealthy poets. He's a contemporary of William Shakespeare. Very accomplished man in many aspects. He tries to make a colony in Roanoke, but the timing is awful. I believe he starts it in 1587, which, that's an awful time to be on the ocean, because in 1588, the Spanish Armada invades. And while the Spanish Armada is being built, the English ships can't really do anything. So there's several years where the entire English Navy has to protect England. So Walter Raleigh brings these ships over, drops off the settlers, in the New World, in America, and he goes back, and he's supposed to keep going back and forth and resupplying them and bringing new people and equipment and money and supplies, but he can't. So it takes him 2 years, right? So it's 1587, then the Armada sails and they defeat the Armada, and he can finally get some ships over there, and he comes back and everybody's gone. All they see is written on a tree somewhere. There's something called Krakatoa. I think it means another island. There was Roanoke and there was Krakatoa I don't even know if I'm saying that. Krakatoa that sounds like an Indonesian volcano. Anyway, there was something written on a tree and it was related to an island nearby, but they find no trace of the colonists. We don't know if they died, if they ran away, if they were eaten by animals, if they, joined a tribe of natives and merged with them. Nobody knows what happens, and they don't even, because of the financial situation and fighting with Spain off and on until Queen Elizabeth dies, there's no attempt to go back. But then in the middle of King James' reign in the 1610s, a company called the Virginia Company is formed. It's almost like a corporation, very modern thing. They start to gather some investment, and they go over back to Virginia to try and find gold, because that's what the Spanish did. The Spanish went over to Mexico and they went over to South America, and they found mountains of silver and gold. Remember? That's how they became so rich. That's how they became so powerful. That's why Henry VII married Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, and Henry VIII ended up being married to the Spanish princess. All that story is because Spain discovered the New World because of Columbus. And after Columbus died, Hernan Cortez found Mexico found the Aztec Empire, and in the South American area, another guy, what's his name? I'm not going to be able to remember his name. Pisa, the conqueror of the Inca. So in the South America, I should be able to remember his name. Can't remember. Let me search. Let me just search. Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Please tell me quick. Pizarro. I knew it would start with a P. Francisco Pizarro. I can't leave that guy out. Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro are not in the book, but one of them conquered the Aztec. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec. It's an incredible story, a tragic one, but very interesting story. And a similar tragedy happens with the Inca. And when they take over those empires, they find that the Aztec have a lot of gold, and the Inca have a lot of silver, an incredible amount of silver, like 5 times more silver than the total amount of silver in Europe. That's how much that's how rich the Spanish are. If you take all the silver in Europe in 1600, that is only the amount of silver they get from South America is 5 times that. So you can imagine what happens to the economy when you have a money supply that increases by 500%. That's a problem for inflation. But anyway, going back to this whole scenario with the English, they're finally going to go there and try and find gold, which they will not find because there's no gold in the forest of Virginia and the mountains. So they don't find any gold there, and their effort starts to fail. So that Virginia company starts to go bankrupt, and they get their charter taken away by James. So the crown starts managing Virginia. It belongs to the king, and they name the town Jamestown, and they name the river the James River, right? And this is the first settlement that sticks for the English. By this point, the Spanish have like 100 towns, right? This is 1620. The Spanish have been there for 100 years already. So they're way behind. But didn't seem to matter, because once the floodgates were open, the English started making their way over. North, you have the French. South, you have the Spanish. And there's the Dutch and the Swedish also try and make their own colonies, but the English managed to, as I told you, New Amsterdam was captured and renamed New York after King James II, who ran away with a nosebleed and lost his kingdom to William III. The Swedish colony was in Delaware, and the Swedish colony just wasn't supported very much by Sweden. And they were actually taken over by the Dutch first, and then the English took over the Dutch and the Swedish colonies. So now it's just England in the middle, France, New France north of them in Quebec, which is now Quebec anyway. Quebec City was there. And south of them in Florida and South America, you have Spanish and Portuguese. So you've got 4 players. They start to disagree about how they want to live in America. As we said last week, one of the most important things about America is freedom. They want to have their own lifestyle. So immediately, New England, which is the Puritan settlement of Plymouth, they go there, and then they have, within one generation, the Puritans are disagreeing with each other. The first generation is very strict and wants everything to be done exactly the way a good Puritan should, as it is in the book. As I told you, eat, sleep, work, pray. But within 1 or 2 generations, they're less interested in having that strict lifestyle. So they still, go to church, but they don't want to just go to church. So they start disagreeing about things. So they split. So then you have Plymouth and you have Massachusetts. It's Massachusetts Bay. It's supposed to be one colony. It's supposed to be one group. But it splits into Plymouth and Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. So you've got these different colonies, and they're all part of New England, and they're all kind of Puritan, but they have their own flavors. They have a little bit differences, but Boston ends up being the most significant settlement in New England, right? Boston's there. Let's go back to Virginia. The Puritans, they're next. New England's next to develop, but it's farther north, and those Americans are quite different than the ones in Virginia. In Virginia, what starts to make Virginia grow, and Virginia is the largest, has the most population, and has the most money. This is where they find out that they can plant tobacco, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese have already been growing it. They find that the Virginia soil and the Virginia weather is perfect for tobacco. So they start growing tobacco and they start getting rich. James hates tobacco. He actually writes that cigars and tobacco are horrible for you. It's the devil's smoke, blah, blah, blah. But he can't ignore the amount of money that is coming in. This is big, big money. So tobacco plantations start multiplying, and they create a new wealthy class. There's an upper class in Virginia, and they start to imitate the British, right? They are British. They start to imitate England. They want to drink tea. They want to have big houses. They want to have servants. They want to have furniture. They want to read English newspapers. These people are turning Virginia into another England. This is, they kind of left, unlike the people in New England, they kind of left, to make their own version of a society. But also, even in New England, there's, one of the reasons the Boston Tea Party happens is because they're drinking a lot of tea, right? From 1620 onward, each generation of Americans wants to be recognized as a real British person who doesn't live in England, but has the money, has the status, has the education, has the connections and the experience that any person in England does. But the people in England, the people in London, look at them as a different class. They're colonists. They're down here. You live in London. You're rich in London. You're up here. You're rich in New York or Philadelphia or Virginia, in Richmond. You're down there. Doesn't matter if you're George Washington or you're Benjamin Franklin. This is going to be a big problem. These guys, they see them, the British see them as lower level than them. And the Americans, as you know, don't see themselves as lower level than anybody. Pennsylvania is a really cool place because that's a place ruled by Quakers. And the story about Quakers is too long to tell. But they're a type of dissenter. They're a radical type. They actually used to shake and stuff. They had some crazy ideas. They actually didn't, when the Quakers were in England in the 17th century, they thought that you didn't even need the Bible. So they're going to be even more radical than the Puritans, right? You think the Puritans are radical? Listen to this. Cromwell, they wanted to fight with Cromwell and support Cromwell. He refused because he thought they were gone too far. The fanatical Puritan Cromwell, who killed thousands of Irish Catholics and cut off the king's head, he thinks the Quakers went too far. That's shocking. So this is what they originally did. They said, actually, worshiping anything is wrong. What you really need to do is directly commune with God, okay? So we're not going to have church services anymore. We're just going to have meetings. Nobody's a minister. Nobody is leading. There's no hierarchy at all. Everybody's the same. Everybody's the same level. This is the society of friends. Okay? So on Sunday, we're all going to sit there. We're going to come and sit there in a meeting, and we're just going to wait for God to communicate directly to us. I'd be waiting for a long time. They had to do some special meditation, or they thought they actually had some message. So they would just, meditate and pray and wait. But they wouldn't read the Bible. There was no organization. There was no leader or anything. That's what the Quaker religion was. There should be no difference between, and they believed that all of the money and wealth of the upper class should be taken, confiscated, and redistributed equally amongst everyone. It's a very communist kind of idea. This is the original Quaker concept. But as you can imagine, the king and the queen hated that even more than the Puritans. It's the worst idea they've ever heard. Like, what are you supposed to do with bishops and kings and queens if there's no difference between everybody? You don't need a king if everybody's the same. You don't need a bishop or a priest. You don't even need the Bible to tell you what to do. You're just gonna directly share everything and have the experience of religion in your own way, but with a group. So they were very unpopular, and basically they were outlawed. They became an illegal group. So their solution to this was very revolutionary too. They decided that they would become pacifists. So they did not fight. They did not, they were the Society of Friends. So they just they were not violent. Unlike the Puritans, who had a revolution, picked up guns, supported parliament, were involved in politics. Quakers just practiced their religion and tried non-resistance. Didn't protest or anything. People grabbed them and throw them in jail. They didn't do anything. Like Gandhi, kind of like Gandhi. Sometimes they would do weird things like just take their clothes off and like run around naked, or like shake them. That's why they're called Quakers, because they shake. So they went from this kind of extreme cultish kind of group to this passive, equal rights, kind of attractive community. Most of them were not wealthy people, but strangely enough, one of the most important wealthy people in King Charles II's court was William Penn. William Penn the Jr., I think his father was named William Penn as well. He became a Quaker, and like he would go to these meetings, and like he's this rich upper class, duke, baron, your grace level, wealthy. The king owes him tons of money. And he's wealthier than 1,000 of the other Quakers, but he would go to the meetings and sit there with them beside the poor beggar and the guy who makes shoes and the guy who fixes leather, the guy who makes nails and stuff. He'd just be sitting with them. It would be like Elon Musk or Bill Gates coming and sitting in our classroom with you guys. Anyway, William Penn becomes a Quaker at just the right time. King Charles doesn't have enough money to pay him back the money he owes his father, so he gives him land in America instead, and he becomes the owner of Pennsylvania. And when he makes Pennsylvania, he does it on the basis of what the Quaker religion has become. Freedom of worship. You can be a woman, you can be a man, you can be old, you can be young, you can be rich, you can be poor, doesn't matter. Everybody's an equal. So that he creates starts this city called Philadelphia, which is still called the city of brotherly love because of the Quakers. Pennsylvania, named after William Penn, and he creates this kind of like freedom religious paradise. And Philadelphia quickly becomes one of the biggest cities in the colonies because native people can live there. Like they're notorious for actually, saying to the native people, I want to build a farm here. Can I pay you? Like, can I give you some equipment or some guns and stuff? Like they trade. They're still it's not ideal. It's not fair, like equal, fair trade by any means. But they're not chasing the natives away, taking their land. They make contracts with them. Native people can live amongst them. They can walk down the street in Philadelphia. There's no discrimination or violence between them. They try and live in harmony. So not just Quakers go there, Catholics go there, Jewish people go there, Native people go there. Everybody starts thinking, well, maybe I want to live in Philadelphia. It's not that type of city anymore. But this was the golden age of Philadelphia in the beginning. Benjamin Franklin ends up going there. It's one of the most important cities in the United States. It isn't really anymore. It's a totally different place. But its original design and its original, culture was very different and very attractive. So it grew very quickly. Maryland is an interesting story because this guy named Lord Baltimore, and there's a Calvert. There's a Calvert involved. Lord Calvert involved as well. this guy, he's Catholic, and he establishes the city of Baltimore and the colony of Maryland, so that people who are Catholic in England have somewhere they can go where they're allowed to worship, because Catholic religion, Catholicism becomes illegal in England. You have to be Anglican. So he creates a Catholic colony, and all the Catholics move to Maryland. That's nice for them. New York belonged to the Dutch. So you got like these Dutch Reform people, which are kind of like Puritans and kind of like Presbyterians. They're, pretty hardline Protestants. That's New York. But New York is also famous as a trading place where when you walk down the street, you can hear 100 different languages. Sorry, I think not 100. I'm exaggerating. I think it's 20. The historian that wrote, I'm misquoting. 20 different languages. That sounds more reasonable. You got Spanish, you got Portuguese, you got French, you got Dutch, you got English, and then you have all these native languages, because there's all these tribes of natives. And New Amsterdam was on an island. It's on the island Manhattan, is the downtown of New York now. It's called Manhattan still. That was a place where all traders from all countries congregated. The Dutch became the greatest traders in the world in the 17th century, and that was Amsterdam was the richest, most important trading port in Europe, and New Amsterdam, it was in the coast of North America, was the most important on the Atlantic, the other side of the Atlantic. When the English took it over, the flavor remained, the multicultural, cosmopolitan aspect and economic, engine of New York continued. It didn't really get going until hundreds of years later, when New York City would become the largest, richest city in the world eventually. But the framework for this multicultural, cosmopolitan mega city was already laid by the Dutch. So you got a Dutch Reform, you got your people from all different cultures speaking different languages. This is what New York is today. It's the city. I love New York. It's the city of the world, right? You can get the best food, the best Italian food, the best Indian food, the best Chinese food. You can go to Chinatown. You can go to uptown, downtown, Central Park. It's very, very diverse. It's a very cool city. So all kinds of people from all walks of life were there. And that's New York City still has the same reputation. And some of these things have remained. The culture is still intact. Although they evolve, of course. Okay, what can I talk about next? I think I'm going to stop there, because this is related to this is more related to slavery, so I'll include this into another. But basically, as these colonies develop, they get bigger and bigger, and they need more and more people. There's going to be, by the 1720s, the colonies are going to be, the trade balance is going to be unfavorable for England. Like, the colonies are going to be selling more, exporting more to England than England is sending to them. So their exports are going to outproduce England, which is not something that the United Kingdom wants to happen. They want, in this day and age, they believe that negative trade balances is the worst thing. Some people still think that, but the United States has had a negative trade balance with a lot of countries, including Korea, for a long time. It doesn't seem to be affecting their economy that much. But at that point in time, they wanted to export more than they imported. But the American colonies started to outproduce them. Not outproduce them, but the trade balance between the mother country and the colonies started to favor the colonies. When that happened, it was partly because there's so much land. They can produce so much. They can make rice and tobacco and cotton and sugar and indigo. They have all these resources. They can send all this stuff back. And England doesn't have that. They have manufacturing and they have manpower, but they don't have those resources. So at the beginning, they're going to be sending people over, particularly people who are wandering around with no jobs and homeless people, unemployed people, no jobs, criminals, and people who have like no prospects or they're not being paid well or something. They're going to sign contracts. It's like being a slave kind of, but basically you just say, okay, I'm going to go to Virginia and I'm going to work for 7 years, and then all of my debts will be paid. People who are in debt, right? The indebted. There's a lot of these people, and there's a lot of Irish people and Scottish people who also go and they sign a contract, and these contracts last for a certain amount of time, and they have to do the work. They don't get paid a salary, but when they finish the contract, then they're free. So they're like they have a contract for their labor. It's not the same as forced labor. It's cheap labor, but it's over a contract, so they don't really get paid for it. What happens is they earn, the right to be a free person in the colonies, and in some cases, even if they survive their tenure, their 7 years, they would get some land. In the beginning, Virginia, that's one of the things they did. You work for 7 years for a plantation. When you're done, you get your own land. That system started to fall apart by the 1720s. Long before that, actually, it's really in the late 17th century that the number of people coming over and the demand is too high, and they need to find more people to work. But they don't have enough money to pay what people are demanding. The wages that you earn in England are too high for the planters to pay them in America. So they start to look for another way to get some workers. And the Spanish and Portuguese, who destroyed the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, were using native people as slaves. But many of those people were, for various reasons, unfit for working in. Many of them died because of horrible working conditions, and they got sick and they got disease, and they ran away as much as they could and resisted. So they needed more workers, and the Spanish and the Portuguese started importing slaves from Africa. They had already been doing this for a long time when the English started to need more workers, and they decided that the owners of the plantations decided that was the best investment. It became almost an economic necessity, because there wasn't, they couldn't afford to pay the wages that were being asked by servants or English people, or even people from other countries. So to buy a slave for life after the death rate started to drop became the biggest economic advantage. Initially, it wasn't really related to race, but quickly they realized that another advantage of having slaves from a certain area of the world was that you could identify them, right? You could identify them. They weren't the natives. When they ran away, they could run away back to their tribe. They could disappear in the forest, and you could, or if an Irish person escapes slavery and ran away to another colony, you wouldn't be able to easily spot them or separate them from other Northern Europeans. Same thing with the natives. There's lots of natives everywhere. Some of them are free or some of them are not. But when they brought the first Africans over, first black, dark-skinned black people, various, skin colors, but from West Africa, they first brought them over. There weren't any free. There were very few. I shouldn't say there weren't any, but there were very, very few free men who were African. So basically, whenever if you saw in the South, in the southern states, if you saw an African person who was not working and not under a master's supervision, he was trying to escape. So they used that to their advantage, a way of sort of color coding slavery. And that is the beginning of the greatest contradiction in American culture, as I told you in the first class. We're going to talk about Christopher Columbus and what happened to the native population first. Then we'll come back to slavery, and then we'll talk about the American Revolution, which is, these are all going to be topics that we have to deal with in chapter 4 and the next few chapters. Okay? So there we go. We're close to an hour again. That's the normal pace that we go at. So I will see you on Friday in person, unless you have some particular thing that you need to do. If you do have a proper excuse for not attending, then you need to send me an email and tell me why. Otherwise, you'll be marked absent on Friday. Okay? But you know the 3 reasons that are acceptable. So if you email me and I give permission, then that's fine. Okay. Have a good week. Good luck with your other midterms. See you on Friday.